Versailles did not begin as a symbol of destiny. It began as a place of mud, forests, and silence, a modest hunting lodge commissioned in 1623 by King Louis XIII, a man far more comfortable with solitude and ritual than with spectacle. At the time, the site lay well outside Paris, surrounded by marshland and dense woodland, an environment hostile to grand ambition. Yet within this unremarkable landscape lay the seeds of one of history's most audacious architectural and political experiments. Versailles would become not merely a palace, but a machine of power, a stage upon which absolute monarchy was performed daily, and ultimately, a monument to the very forces that would destroy it. When Louis XIV inherited the throne in 1643, at the age of 4, France was a nation scarred by instability. The trauma of the Fronde civil wars, during which rebellious nobles and Parisian mobs challenged royal authority, left an indelible mark on the young king. He learned early that proximity to Paris was a vulnerability, that the nobility, left unchecked, could become a rival power, and that visibility was both a threat and an opportunity. These lessons would shape his reign and find physical expression in stone, mirrors, and gardens. Versailles was not conceived as a retreat from politics, but as its ultimate consolidation. The transformation of Versailles accelerated in the 1660s as Louis XIV began to rule, independently following the death of Cardinal Mazarin. What emerged was not a single architectural vision, but a layered construction project driven by ideology as much as aesthetics. Architects such as Louis Lavaux, decorators like Charles Lebrun, and landscape designer André Lenader were tasked with translating political philosophy into space. Every axis, every vista, every ornament served a purpose. The palace expanded outward from the original lodge, enveloping it within a grand marble envelope, much as the king sought to absorb and neutralize the old nobility within his orbit. Versailles was designed to impose order on chaos. The gardens, stretching endlessly toward the horizon, were laid out with mathematical precision, their symmetry a visual metaphor for royal control over nature itself. Water, scarce in the region, was forcibly redirected through vast hydraulic systems to power fountains that performed on command. These feats of engineering were not merely decorative. They were statements of domination. To walk through Versailles was to experience power not as an abstract concept, but as an environment that shaped movement, sightlines, and behavior. By 1682, when Louis XIV officially moved the royal court to Versailles, the palace had become the gravitational center of France. Nobles were compelled to reside there for much of the year, drawn into a rigid system of court etiquette that revolved entirely around the king's person. Access to the monarch became the currency of influence, and Versailles was the marketplace where that currency was traded. Daily rituals, from the lever to the coucher, transformed the king's private life into a public spectacle, reducing once autonomous aristocrats to participants in an elaborate choreography of submission. This system was extraordinarily effective, but it carried hidden costs. The maintenance of Versailles required immense financial resources, sustained through taxation that fell disproportionately on the peasantry and urban poor. While courtiers competed for favor beneath gilded ceilings, much of France lived on the edge of subsistence. The palace projected an image of harmony and permanence, but beneath its polished surfaces lay mounting social tension. Versailles did not merely reflect inequality, it institutionalized it, embedding hierarchy into daily life and architecture alike. The irony of Versailles is that its greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. By centralizing power so completely, Louis XIV ensured that the monarchy became inseparable from the palace itself. The state was no longer an abstract entity, but a physical place, a court, a spectacle. This fusion of governance and grandeur left little room for adaptation. As long as the system functioned, it appeared invincible. But once pressures mounted economic strain, demographic growth, intellectual challenge, the rigidity of Versailles would prove fatal. By the end of Louis XIV's reign in 1715, the palace stood complete in form, but fragile in meaning. The Sun King had succeeded in creating a symbol that awed Europe, inspiring imitations from Vienna to St. Petersburg. Yet he also left behind a structure dependent on constant performance, constant funding, and constant belief. Versailles required faith in hierarchy, acceptance of inequality, and reverence for monarchy. Without these, its marble and gold would become hollow. As the 18th century unfolded, the palace remained outwardly unchanged, but the world beyond its gates began to shift. New ideas circulated quietly at first, questioning the nature of authority, the legitimacy of inherited power, and the moral cost of excess. Versailles, frozen in its rituals, was ill-equipped to respond. The stage was set for a collision between permanence and change, between spectacle and reality. The palace had been built to last forever, but history was already moving against it. The death of Louis XIV did not bring immediate collapse to Versailles, but it altered the balance that had sustained it. His successors inherited not only the palace, but the immense psychological weight of living within a structure designed to magnify a single, extraordinary personality. Louis XV ascended the throne as a child, and during his minority, the court temporarily retreated to Paris, revealing how dependent Versailles was on the constant presence of authority. When the palace was reoccupied in the early 1720s, it resumed its rituals, but something essential had changed. The performance continued, yet belief in its necessity began to weaken. Louis XV was not the Sun King. Where his great-grandfather had embraced visibility as a source of power, Louis XV increasingly sought privacy. He withdrew from the ceremonial exposure that Versailles demanded, reshaping parts of the palace to accommodate seclusion rather than spectacle. Private apartments expanded, hidden corridors multiplied, and the court became more fragmented. This architectural shift reflected a deeper transformation. Power was no longer radiating outward from a single, omnipresent figure. Instead, it diffused into factions, favorites, and informal networks that operated behind closed doors. The rise of royal mistresses, particularly Madame de Pompadour, illustrated this new reality. Influence at Versailles was no longer exercised solely through rank or lineage, but through proximity and intimacy. Pompadour, born outside the traditional nobility, became a central political and cultural force, shaping patronage, diplomacy, and artistic taste. Her presence exposed the contradictions of a system that claimed divine order while relying increasingly on personal relationships and private persuasion. To critics, Versailles began to look less like a temple of monarchy and more like a theater of intrigue. Meanwhile, the financial foundations of the palace grew increasingly unstable. France's involvement in costly wars, including the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, drained the treasury without delivering lasting advantage. Military defeat undermined the image of royal competence, while debt accumulated at an alarming rate. Versailles, with its constant demands for maintenance, staffing, and ceremonial display, became an ever more visible symbol of misallocated resources. The palace did not cause France's financial crisis, but it made that crisis impossible to ignore. Beyond the court, the intellectual climate of Europe was shifting. Enlightenment thinkers questioned the very principles upon which Versailles rested: absolute authority, inherited privilege, and the fusion of power with spectacle. Philosophers such as Montesquieu and Voltaire did not attack the palace directly, but their ideas eroded the assumptions that justified its existence. Reason, law, and accountability entered public discourse, challenging a system that relied on tradition and hierarchy. The palace remained magnificent, but its ideological foundations were being quietly dismantled. This growing disconnect between appearance and reality was mirrored in daily life at Versailles. Rituals continued with mechanical precision, yet they increasingly felt empty, even to those who performed them. Courtiers maintained elaborate schedules of attendance and etiquette, but the rewards of participation diminished. Offices lost their influence, pensions failed to keep pace with costs, and competition intensified for shrinking favor. The palace became crowded not with power, but with anxiety, its gilded rooms filled with people desperate to maintain relevance in a system that no longer delivered certainty. When Louis XVI ascended the throne in 1774, he inherited a palace that still commanded awe, but no longer commanded consensus. Personally conscientious and morally earnest, he lacked both the theatrical instincts of Louis XIV and the political flexibility required by a changing age. Versailles overwhelmed him. its rituals constrained rather than empowered, and its expectations magnified his hesitations. Attempts at reform, particularly in finance, collided with entrenched privilege protected within the very walls of the palace. Marie Antoinette, arriving from Austria as a teenage bride, encountered Versailles as both prison and spectacle. Its relentless scrutiny and rigid etiquette clashed with her desire for intimacy and autonomy. Her retreat into private spaces such as the Petit Trianon was not merely personal indulgence, but a response to an environment that denied genuine human connection. Yet this withdrawal proved disastrous for public perception. At a time of mounting hardship, royal privacy was interpreted as indifference, reinforcing the image of a court detached from reality. By the late 18th century, Versailles had become a paradox. It was more magnificent than ever, yet more vulnerable than it had ever been. Its architecture proclaimed permanence, while its society revealed fragility. The palace continued to function, but it no longer adapted. Each attempt to preserve tradition deepened the divide between court and country. The golden cage that had once tamed the nobility now confined the monarchy itself. Outside the palace gates, economic hardship intensified. Poor harvests, rising bread prices, and systemic inequality fueled resentment that could no longer be contained. Versailles, distant both physically and symbolically from the daily struggles of ordinary people, became an object of anger rather than admiration. What had been built to embody the state now appeared to consume it. As France edged toward crisis, the palace remained frozen in ritual, its mirrors reflecting not power, but denial. The machinery of absolutism continued to operate, even as the foundations beneath it cracked. The collapse, when it came, would not arrive as a sudden thunderclap, but as the inevitable consequence of a system that had mistaken spectacle for stability. The final rupture between Versailles and the nation it claimed to embody did not begin with violence, but with absence. In May 1789, representatives of the Estates General arrived near the palace, summoned by a monarchy desperate to resolve a financial crisis it could no longer manage alone. For the first time in more than a century, the king had been forced to acknowledge that absolute authority was insufficient. Yet Versailles, with all its grandeur, proved incapable of accommodating the political transformation that this moment demanded. The palace had been built to display power, not to share it. As deputies gathered, the symbolic geography of Versailles revealed its fatal flaw. The representatives of the Third Estate, who spoke for the vast majority of the French population, were physically and metaphorically marginalized. Locked out of formal chambers, they assembled in improvised spaces, culminating in the tennis court oath a declaration that sovereignty no longer resided exclusively with the king, but with the nation. This act did not merely challenge royal authority, it rendered Versailles obsolete as the center of political life. Power was no longer something that emanated from marble halls and gilded ceilings. Within the palace, confusion reigned. Louis XVI hesitated, torn between reform and tradition, concession and control. Advisors offered conflicting counsel, while court factions maneuvered to protect privilege. The rituals of Versailles continued even as their meaning dissolved. Courtiers dressed for ceremony, while the language of revolution entered public discourse. The disconnect was no longer subtle. The palace had become a stage performing to an audience that had already left. The summer of 1789 shattered any remaining illusions. News of unrest spread rapidly, carried by rumor, pamphlets, and fear. The storming of the Bastille in July marked a psychological turning point. Though physically distant from Versailles, its impact reverberated through the palace corridors. Authority, once assumed to be immovable, now appeared fragile. Guards were uneasy, servants whispered, and noble families quietly prepared for flight. Versailles, designed as a fortress of legitimacy, offered no protection against the erosion of belief. In October, the separation between court and country collapsed entirely. A march of women from Paris, driven by hunger and anger, advanced toward Versailles. Their journey transformed the palace from a distant symbol into a tangible target. When they arrived, they confronted not an abstract monarchy, but real doors, real guards, and real people. The breach of the palace was not just physical, it was moral. The sanctity, that had once shielded royal authority, dissolved under the weight of popular presence. The decision to move the royal family to Paris marked the true end of Versailles as a seat of power. When Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette departed under armed escort, they carried with them the last vestiges of absolutism. Versailles was left behind intact in stone, but emptied of purpose. The palace that had been constructed to centralize the state was now irrelevant to it. Political life shifted to the capital, where power was contested, negotiated, and increasingly radicalized. In the years that followed, Versailles entered a strange limbo. It was no longer royal, yet not immediately revolutionary. Rooms once filled with ceremony stood silent. Furnishings were sold, artworks dispersed, and spaces repurposed. The palace survived not because it was essential, but because it was too monumental to erase. Its endurance became ironic, a structure built to proclaim eternal monarchy outlasting the monarchy itself. The revolution ultimately consumed the individuals who had inhabited Versailles, but it preserved the palace as a relic. As France moved through Republic, Empire, and Restoration, Versailles was repeatedly reinterpreted. It became a museum, a national monument, a site of diplomacy, and a canvas onto which each generation projected its understanding of the past. The building remained, but its meaning shifted, no longer a symbol of dominance, but a warning carved in stone. Versailles thus stands as a paradox of history. It represents the heights of human artistry, coordination and ambition, while simultaneously embodying the dangers of isolation and excess. Its creators believed that by controlling space, ritual, and visibility, they could control society itself. What they failed to grasp was that legitimacy cannot be sustained by architecture alone. When belief erodes, even the most magnificent structures become hollow. The fall of Versailles was not the result of a single decision or event, but of accumulated distance between ruler and ruled, image and reality, tradition and transformation. It reminds us that power rooted only in spectacle is inherently unstable. When conditions change, when people demand participation rather than performance, the palace becomes a cage, and the throne a liability. Today, visitors walk through Versailles in awe, surrounded by mirrors, gardens, and silence. What they encounter is not merely the memory of kings, but the trace of a system that mistook permanence for legitimacy. The palace endures, but the world that created it does not. In that contrast lies its enduring lesson: no structure, however grand, can outlast the trust of those it claims to govern. After the royal family left Versailles in October 1789, the palace entered a period of profound silence, one that contrasted sharply with the relentless political noise now consuming Paris. This silence was not merely physical, but symbolic. Versailles had been designed as the beating heart of the French state, a place where power was visible, ritualized, and unquestioned. With the court gone, that heart stopped. What remained was an immense architectural body, intact yet functionless, struggling to find meaning in a world that no longer required what it represented. During the early years of the Revolution, Versailles became an uncomfortable inheritance. Revolutionary authorities did not destroy the palace outright, not out of reverence, but out of pragmatism. Its sheer scale made demolition impractical, and its contents, furniture, artworks, decorative objects, represented liquid value for a government desperate for funds. Room by room, the material culture of absolutism was dismantled. Auctions dispersed centuries of royal accumulation into private hands. Gilded chairs, tapestries, clocks, and paintings were sold as commodities, stripped of the ideological framework that had once given them power. This transformation revealed a deeper truth about Versailles: its authority had always been symbolic. Once belief collapsed, the palace could be reduced to inventory. The same halls that once dictated court hierarchy now hosted clerks cataloging assets. Grandeur was reclassified as property. The palace did not fall in flames, it was quietly disassembled by bureaucracy. In this sense, Versailles mirrored the fate of the monarchy itself, undone not only by violence, but by administrative redefinition. Under Napoleon Bonaparte, Versailles was briefly reconsidered, though never fully restored to political relevance. Napoleon understood the power of symbols, but he also recognized that Versailles was inseparable from the Bourbon legacy he sought both to appropriate and transcend. Instead, he favored the Tuileries Palace in Paris, closer to the machinery of the modern state and the army that sustained his rule. Versailles remained on the periphery, too burdened by memory to be useful as a seat of new authority. Throughout the 19th century, the palace drifted through successive regimes, each uncertain how to treat it. Monarchists saw it as a wound, republicans as an embarrassment, and pragmatists as an opportunity. It was Louis Philippe, the so-called citizen king, who finally redefined Versailles in a way that ensured its survival. In 1837, he transformed the palace into a museum of the history of France, reframing it not as a royal residence, but as a national archive in stone. This act was both preservative and political. By filling Versailles with paintings celebrating French history, from medieval battles to revolutionary moments, Louis Philippe neutralized its association with absolute monarchy and repurposed it as a unifying narrative space. Yet even as a museum, Versailles could not escape its contradictions. Visitors admired its beauty while confronting the excess that had helped provoke revolution. The palace became a site of education and reflection, but also of tension. It forced France to remember a past that was both glorious and catastrophic. Unlike ruins, which allow for distance, Versailles remained complete, confronting each generation with the uncomfortable reality that systems can collapse while their monuments endure. The 20th century added new layers to this paradox. In 1919, Versailles became the site of the treaty that formally ended the First World War. In the Hall of Mirrors, a room originally designed to glorify Louis XIV dominance, representatives of defeated Germany were compelled to sign a document that reshaped global politics. The choice of location was deliberate. Versailles, once a symbol of unchecked power, was now being used to impose accountability and punishment. History had inverted the meaning of the space. This moment underscored the palace's transformation from a national symbol into a global one. Versailles was no longer about France alone, but about the cycles of power, humiliation, and consequence that define political history. The mirrors that once reflected royal processions now reflected diplomats negotiating the fate of millions. The building remained the same, its function had evolved beyond recognition. In the modern era, Versailles exists as a curated memory. Millions visit each year, walking the same corridors once reserved for kings, yet doing so as observers rather than subjects. The palace generates revenue, sustains conservation efforts, and fuels cultural tourism. It survives not because it commands obedience, but because it invites interpretation. This shift is its final transformation. Versailles no longer enforces hierarchy, it provokes questions. Those questions remain unsettling. How could a system so refined, so aesthetically sophisticated, be so disconnected from the realities of its society? How did architecture intended to stabilize power instead amplify its fragility? Versailles teaches that control achieved through spectacle is inherently brittle. The more energy a system invests in appearances, the less resilient it becomes when conditions change. The palace's endurance does not redeem the system that created it. Instead, it preserves evidence. Versailles stands as a document written in stone, recording the ambitions, fears, and miscalculations of absolute rule. Its survival allows history to be studied not as abstraction, but as environment, a physical reminder that power is never permanent, and that legitimacy cannot be manufactured through grandeur alone. As visitors exit the gates of Versailles, they leave behind more than a tourist site. They leave a cautionary monument to imbalance, a place where beauty and injustice coexisted, where silence eventually replaced ceremony. The palace remains, but it no longer speaks with authority. It speaks with memory. By the time Versailles had fully transitioned into a monument rather than a mechanism of power, it had acquired a second life, one shaped not by kings or revolutionaries, but by memory. Memory, unlike authority, does not command. It seduces, reframes, and selectively forgets. In this phase of its existence, Versailles became less dangerous, but no less influential. Its meaning was no longer dictated by a court protocol or enforced by law, but continuously renegotiated by historians, politicians, artists, and the public itself. This transformation exposed a paradox at the heart of historical preservation. To conserve Versailles was to preserve beauty, craftsmanship, and cultural achievement. But to do so also risked aestheticizing a system built on inequality, coercion, and exclusion. The palace's polished floors and restored ceilings, could easily obscure the human costs that had once sustained them. The danger was not denial, but dilution, the gradual replacement of historical understanding with visual admiration. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, representations of Versailles increasingly emphasized romance over reality. Paintings, novels, and later films portrayed court life as elegant and tragic rather than political and extractive. Marie Antoinette, once vilified as a symbol of excess, was slowly recast as a misunderstood victim of circumstance. Louis XIV, architect of absolutism, was admired for his cultural patronage more than scrutinized for his consolidation of power. Versailles, in this narrative, became a stage for personal drama rather than a machine of governance. This shift did not occur accidentally. It reflected a broader European struggle to reconcile admiration for cultural heritage with the moral reckoning demanded by modern political values. As democratic ideals spread, direct glorification of absolute monarchy became untenable. Nostalgia offered a compromise. By transforming Versailles into a site of beauty divorced from responsibility, society could enjoy its legacy without confronting its implications too directly. Yet history resisted simplification. Scholars continued to document the palace's role in centralizing authority, draining state finances, and alienating the broader population. Economic historians traced the flow of resources from provinces to court. Social historians reconstructed the rigid hierarchies that governed access, favor, and survival within the palace walls. Architectural historians revealed how design itself functioned as a language of control, shaping movement, visibility, and proximity to power. These academic efforts slowly filtered into public interpretation. Exhibitions began to contextualize objects rather than merely display them. Labels acknowledged not only craftsmanship, but labor. Restoration projects increasingly emphasized transparency, documenting funding sources and conservation choices. Versailles was no longer presented as a timeless fairy tale, but as a product of specific political decisions made by identifiable individuals. The palace's global visibility also complicated its meaning. For international visitors, Versailles often functioned as shorthand for old Europe, a symbol of aristocratic excess against which modern societies defined themselves. This outsider perspective sharpened critical distance. Versailles was admired, but also implicitly contrasted with republican values, social mobility, and accountability. Its grandeur served as a foil, reminding viewers why such systems had been dismantled. At the same time, Versailles remained vulnerable to misinterpretation. The very scale that once enforced hierarchy now encouraged abstraction. It was easy to be overwhelmed by the Hall of Mirrors and forget the administrative machinery that made it possible. Easy to admire the gardens without considering the ecological and human cost of maintaining them. Easy to photograph without reflecting. This tension between spectacle and understanding is not unique to Versailles, but Versailles magnifies it. Few sites so perfectly embody the illusion of permanence, the belief that beauty, once achieved, can stabilize power indefinitely. History demonstrates the opposite. The palace did not prevent revolution, it intensified its causes. The effort to freeze hierarchy in stone only made its collapse more dramatic. Versailles ultimately teaches that systems obsessed with appearance are often the least adaptable. The monarchy invested immense resources in maintaining ritual precision, spatial dominance, and visual supremacy, yet it failed to evolve politically at the pace demanded by social and economic change. When legitimacy eroded, no amount of marble or gold could compensate. The palace endured, the system did not. In this sense, Versailles stands as a warning embedded in architecture. It reveals how power can confuse visibility with stability, ceremony with consent. It shows how rulers can mistake admiration for acceptance, silence for loyalty, and tradition for inevitability. These lessons extend far beyond 18th century France. They recur wherever authority prioritizes image over inclusion. Today, as the palace continues to attract millions, its relevance lies not in what it glorifies, but in what it reveals. Versailles invites viewers to question how power represents itself, how inequality hides behind aesthetics, and how societies remember what they choose to preserve. Its survival allows these questions to remain visible. The palace no longer governs, but it endures as a mirror not of kings, but of the human tendency to believe that what is grand must also be just, and that what is beautiful must be eternal. History suggests otherwise. If Versailles survives today, it is not because it adapted, but because it was repurposed. Power abandoned it, history reclaimed it, and modernity transformed it into something both safer and more ambiguous, a symbol without teeth. Yet symbols, even disarmed ones, retain influence. In its afterlife, Versailles ceased to command obedience, but it continued to shape imagination, and in doing so, it revealed how power persists long after authority collapses. The conversion of Versailles from royal residence to national monument was neither immediate nor inevitable. After the Revolution, the palace stood largely empty, its meaning unresolved. It was too charged to destroy outright, yet too dangerous to restore as a symbol of monarchy. For decades, it existed in a liminal state, stripped of furniture, purpose, and certainty. Its halls echoed not with ceremony, but with indecision. What does a republic do with the architectural embodiment of absolutism? The answer emerged gradually in the 19th century, particularly under King Louis-Philippe, who reimagined Versailles as a museum of the history of France. This was not a neutral act of preservation. It was an attempt to domesticate the past, to absorb monarchy, empire, and revolution into a single national narrative. By reframing Versailles as a site of collective memory, rather than dynastic power, the state sought to neutralize its political volatility. Yet this act of reframing came at a cost. To tell a unified story, contradictions had to be softened. Violence became transition. Oppression became context. The palace was transformed into a gallery of heroes and events, arranged to emphasize continuity rather than rupture. In doing so, Versailles became a tool not of royal propaganda, but of national myth-making. This function only intensified in the 20th century. Versailles was no longer merely French history, it became global shorthand for elite excess. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919, signed deliberately in the Hall of Mirrors, demonstrated how the palace's symbolic weight could be weaponized even in modern geopolitics. The location was chosen not for convenience, but for memory. It was meant to remind Germany and the world of past dominance and present reversal. The irony was profound. A palace built to project eternal order became the stage for an agreement that helped destabilize Europe and sow the seeds of future catastrophe. Here, Versailles revealed another truth about power: symbols outlive intentions. The Hall of Mirrors, once designed to reflect the glory of Louis XIV, now reflected humiliation, resentment, and unresolved trauma. Architecture did not dictate meaning, context did. The palace could not control how it was used, only how it was remembered. In the post-war era, Versailles entered yet another phase of existence, one defined by mass tourism. Millions now walk corridors once restricted to a handful of nobles. What was once exclusive is now accessible, even democratic. And yet, this accessibility introduces a new paradox. When everyone can see everything, depth risks being replaced by spectacle. The experience of Versailles today is often fragmented. Visitors encounter highlights: the Hall of Mirrors, the King's Bedchamber, the gardens, but rarely the systemic logic that once bound them together. The palace becomes a sequence of images rather than an argument. Grandeur overwhelms analysis. The structure impresses, but the system that produced it fades into abstraction. This is not accidental. Modern institutions must balance education with entertainment, critique with admiration. Too much condemnation alienates, too much reverence distorts. Versailles thus exists in tension, oscillating between warning and wonder. It must attract visitors to survive, yet risk being misunderstood by them. And yet, within this tension lies its enduring relevance. Versailles offers a rare opportunity to observe how power externalizes itself, how authority seeks validation through space, ritual, and repetition. It shows how inequality can be normalized when embedded in beauty, and how systems can appear stable long after they have begun to rot internally. The palace also reminds us that decline is rarely cinematic. The French monarchy did not collapse because Versailles was stormed in a single dramatic moment. It collapsed because legitimacy eroded quietly year by year, decision by decision. The palace remained immaculate even as trust disintegrated. That dissonance between appearance and reality is perhaps the most dangerous illusion power can sustain. Versailles, in its afterlife, no longer enforces hierarchy, but it still asks questions. Who builds monuments and for whom? What happens when wealth becomes performance rather than function? How long can systems survive when they prioritize image over adaptability? These questions do not belong to the past. They resonate in every era that confuses visibility with authority, admiration with consent. Versailles endures not because it answers them, but because it embodies them. In the end, the palace stands not as proof of monarchy's greatness, nor solely as evidence of its failure, but as a record of human ambition pushed to its limits. It is a reminder that power can be made beautiful, but beauty cannot make power permanent. The fall of Versailles was never sudden. It did not arrive with the thunder of cannon fire or the dramatic tearing down of gates. Instead, it unfolded as an inevitability, slow, structural, and irreversible. Long before the monarchy was overthrown, the palace had already failed in its most essential task, adapting to a changing world. Versailles was designed to immobilize power in ritual, but history rewards movement, flexibility, and reform. In that contradiction lay the palace's fate. By the late 18th century, France was no longer a kingdom that could be governed through spectacle alone. Population growth, rising literacy, economic strain, and Enlightenment philosophy were transforming subjects into citizens. Ideas traveled faster than decrees, and public opinion became a force no palace could contain. Versailles, insulated by privilege and ceremony, remained architecturally magnificent but intellectually isolated. Decisions were filtered through etiquette, hierarchy, and fear of disrupting tradition. Reform became not impossible, but unthinkable. Louis XVI, often remembered as weak or indecisive, was in truth overwhelmed by a system that allowed little room for genuine leadership. Versailles had been built to amplify authority, not to support accountability. Ministers came and went, policies stalled, and crises were managed symbolically rather than structurally. Financial collapse loomed not because France lacked wealth, but because its mechanisms of governance were incompatible with reality. The palace consumed resources while the state bled credibility. Marie Antoinette became the most visible casualty of this imbalance. Her image, carefully constructed and ruthlessly distorted, embodied the growing divide between the court and the people. In truth, many accusations against her were exaggerated or false, but perception had overtaken fact. Versailles had trained France to read power visually, and when that visual language turned against the monarchy, there was no counter-narrative strong enough to survive. The palace that had once manufactured reverence now produced resentment. The outbreak of the French Revolution did not immediately target Versailles, but it rendered it obsolete overnight. When the royal family was forced to leave the palace, in October 1789, escorted back to Paris by a crowd demanding bread and accountability, the moment was both symbolic and terminal. Versailles was abandoned, not because it was destroyed, but because it no longer mattered. Power had shifted from marble halls to streets, assemblies, and eventually to the machinery of the modern state. This abandonment revealed the ultimate vulnerability of monumental power. It depends on belief. Once belief dissolves, architecture becomes inert. The gilded ceilings, the axial gardens, the mirrors designed to multiply authority, all remained physically intact, yet they could no longer command obedience. Versailles had not been conquered, it had been outgrown. In retrospect, the collapse of Versailles was not a failure of construction, but of imagination. The palace was perfect at expressing hierarchy, but incapable of negotiating equality. It excelled at permanence, but could not accommodate change. It created a universe in which power was absolute, but responsibility was diffuse. When confronted with a society demanding participation rather than spectacle, Versailles had no language left to speak. And yet, its story endures precisely because it failed so completely. Versailles offers a rare clarity about the life cycle of power, how it rises through innovation, solidifies through ritual, and collapses through rigidity. It reminds us that dominance sustained by image alone is fragile, and that systems built to glorify the few often blind themselves to the many. The secret history of Versailles is not hidden in conspiracy or scandal, but in structure. The palace fell because it worked exactly as it was designed to, and the world moved on without it. That is the inevitability no amount of gold could prevent. The story of Versailles is not simply the story of a palace, but of a system that mistook grandeur for stability and ritual for legitimacy. Built to embody absolute power, Versailles succeeded brilliantly in projecting authority, yet failed to question the conditions that made such authority fragile. Its collapse reminds us that power sustained by spectacle alone cannot survive a world that demands accountability, participation, and change. When institutions stop listening, even the most magnificent symbols become hollow. Versailles teaches a timeless lesson: inequality can be hidden behind beauty for only so long. Architecture can impress, wealth can dazzle, and ceremony can distract, but none of them can replace trust. The fall of the French monarchy was not caused by the palace itself, but by the distance it created between rulers and reality. In that distance, resentment grew, belief faded, and collapse became inevitable. If this documentary made you reflect on how power is built, maintained, and lost, share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective adds meaning to history. And if you value deeply researched, cinematic documentary stories that explore the hidden structures behind wealth, empire, and decline, consider subscribing to the channel. By subscribing, you help keep these stories alive not as spectacles, but as lessons we still need to hear today.